Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us on our third session of Career Pathways. Today, we're focusing on careers in media and journalism with the theme of keeping knowledge alive. We have an awesome panel today to join us, and we'll turn it over to them in a moment. But in the meantime, a few housekeeping items. If you have any questions or if you're having any technical issues, please use the chat function. And that will get to me, and I will go ahead and do my best to address any issues as they pop up. How we're going to have the session today is we're going to be starting with a brief introduction from all of our panelists, and then we'll move into a Q&A. And at the end, if there's time, we have a short reflection that we may do, but we really want to give most time to your questions that you may have. So with that, my name is Beth Schill. I'm a career advisor at the College Career Education Center. I work in the areas of government, nonprofit, and education. And thank you all for being with us today. And I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Jackie Banks.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jackie Banks. I'm the Arts, Media, and Communication Advisor at Georgetown's College Career Education Center. So some of you I have seen before in the office, some of you I haven't. If I haven't, you're always welcome for Zoom appointments. So could talk more about that later. Panelists, thank you for joining us today. I'm just going to go down the row as I see you, and if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself briefly, that would be great. So, Lucia, you're the first one, so over to you.
Hi, thanks, Jackie. Great to be here. My name is Lucia. I'm an SFS graduate from 2015. I am currently in Buenos Aires, Argentina. I am from Argentina, and I am currently working as a correspondent for BBC Radio and also as a multimedia reporter for Redacción, which is an Argentine media startup. After Georgetown, I also worked as a news producer for Al Jazeera English in New York and as a freelancer for several international media outlets.
Great, thank you, Lucia. Paul?
Hello, everybody. I am Paul Albergo. I'm the executive editor at a subsidiary of a company Bloomberg called Bloomberg Industry Group. We were acquired by them. We used to be known by our acronym BNA. I've been there 34 years. I always hesitate to point that out. I am a graduate of Georgetown. I graduated more than 34 years ago, we'll just say that. And I had a brief stint before I joined news in communications and public relations, working as the assistant director of communications at the DC Medical Society.
Thank you, Paul. Anne, over to you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. Jackie, thanks for inviting me. I'm not a GU graduate, but I do run I'm the assistant director of our undergraduate journalism program. I also teach two of our entry-level journalism courses, so would love to see everybody in those classes in the fall, wherever we are. Before that, I spent many years at USA Today covering basically entertainment and celebrities, and started my career at the Washington Post answering telephones. So I look forward to hearing what everyone has to say and to being here. Thank you.
And you can't have a journalism career panel without you, really. So that's why you're here. Okay. Last but not least, Ian.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. Thanks for having me on the panel, Jackie. My name is Ian Philbrick. I am a 2017 graduate of the college. I majored in government, and I did a Latin American Studies certificate. And now, since graduation, I've worked at the New York Times. I've been in a couple of roles. One, I was doing work in the opinion section for the past 3 years, and now I've just moved over to the news side of the paper, where I'm working on a newsletter that we put out every morning called The Morning. The name is apropos, and it's basically a rundown of a lot of the stuff that the newsroom is producing. I get to do my own independent journalism. I get to write and edit for it. And so that's been sort of my life for the past month, as we've all been transitioning to a quite different way of doing this job and doing the work that I think is really important, especially because of the times we're in. So I'm really excited for all your questions and happy to be here.
Thanks, Ian. Okay, you know, I have to say, during our pre-call, we were trying to figure out what to start with. You know, what is the grand question that everybody wants to know, and it's tough to say. So I'm going to do a very broad one, and it really relates to you know, what's going on in the world right now, but also the reality of journalism. So we're seeing a lot in terms of furloughs. It's difficult to get a job. As Anne said before, there's a lot of doom and gloom in the industry right now. So my question to all of you, but maybe over to you, Paul. I'm going to put you on the spot because you spoke a little about this in the beginning in our pre-call, but why journalism? Why now?
So there are a number of really good reasons. I mean, we're at a very interesting moment in journalism. The doom and gloom you're hearing is largely because we are going through a kind of an upheaval in terms of how people pay for news. But what the last couple months have shown us is that the need for news is not only is it not gone away, but it's actually the need is even greater now than ever before. And the nature of news is going to change. What we've seen as a result of the calls from the protesters around Black Lives Matter really is showing that news has really let whole parts of the population down by not really providing the kind of coverage that was necessary, by ignoring stories, by not telling them correctly. The need for a kind of a correction there is great. I think what we are looking at now is an inflection point. There's important stories to tell. There's a need to tell them. It's now a matter of the business side to figure out a way of how you make money in that area. And there's money to be had. So if there's money to be had, someone's going to step into that void. For those of us interested in the profession, there's never been a better time to be in it because the stories are so profound and the difference you can make is so great that it really is a very satisfying career, and it will correct itself.
Thanks, Paul. And I'm wondering, Lucia, with your work in Redaction, and I'm wondering if you can talk to us a little bit more about that aspect of your work life, and maybe a little bit about that, maybe your answer to that question.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with Paul. I think the current context might lead a lot of us to feel hopeless, anxious, depressed, but these situations, I think, show that journalism is important more than ever. I really think that journalism is one of the most powerful tools to promote empathy, to promote change. And if you really care about these issues, that through journalism, you can make a difference. So that is what initially led me to go into journalism, what led me to work for an outlet like Al Jazeera that has as a mission to give a voice to the voiceless, and then eventually led me to Redacción, which is, like you said, Jackie, new media outlet here in Argentina. We're very small, we're 15 people, but our mission is to try to do a different type of journalism, a journalism that's based on in trying to promote our readers to take action on different issues. It's trying to show not only problems, but also solutions. So we focus a lot of our stories on what's called solutions journalism, which is a type of journalism in which you not only focus on uncovering different social problems, but also on telling stories about how different people, organizations, governments are systematically working towards changing that. So we feel like by exposing that, you are giving people hope, that things that can also change, that there's also a way out of this. And that can be with regards to the education system, with regards to gun violence, with regards to mass incarceration, whatever issue you can think of. So I think all of those elements are things that we're increasingly seeing in journalism, but that we need to see even more in these times, because we are seeing globally that a lot of people, because of the current context, are pushing away from the news. They're saying this is too much, this is too negative. People are feeling overwhelmed by that, and you need, as a journalist, to not only tell these stories, but also try to expose ways in which we can constructively as a society work towards a better place.
I'm curious, over to you, Ian, because now we come from Redacción, which is kind of it's a startup. It's new, nonprofit, correct, Lucia?
Yes, exactly.
That's right. Okay, we go to the Times. Okay, so so what do you? How would you respond, I suppose, or think about the variety of these issues in terms of what's happening now and the Times' response to it? Maybe even you personally as a journalist.
Yeah, sure. I think those are all really vital questions. And I actually, as I was listening to Lucia and Paul, I kept thinking about how I think a lot of the same questions are being debated in the walls of the Times, in the pages of the Times every day. And this is not to at all try to equate the situation in the journalism landscape. I do think what we're seeing happen to local publications in particular is really scary and is really bad for the country. And I think to the extent that this is a business problem, that is something that I think local outlets are trying to address. And I think you see sort of green shoots of success in nonprofit news and other sort of collaborations, other sort of arrangements that help to make up that deficit in the ad market. But I do think even at the Times, right, these are challenges that people are confronting both on the business side. We have increasingly oriented our business around subscribers, right? Trying to get the people who pay for Times journalism to be the ones who are really supporting it. That's become particularly acute in an era where the ad market has fallen out. The bottom has fallen out of that market because of the pandemic. And so I think that we at the Times and lots of other newsrooms have tried to make that pivot to having people who pay for Times journalism be the ones that are supporting it. And that really is the case. When you guys buy a subscription, you are funding our correspondents to go overseas, maybe in better times, to go overseas and cover what is happening in the EU or what is happening in Russia, in dangerous places, and in relatively safer ones like this country. Big changes that are happening even so, politically and otherwise. And then I'll say sort of on the journalism side, I think what Lucia was saying, I very much think is a debate at the Times as well. What is the purpose of our journalism? Is it about, you see a lot of words debated, like objectivity and fairness, and what does that mean? Whose stories are we trying to tell, and to what end? And I think that this era in particular, these questions, a lot of them predate the pandemic, but I think they are, and they predate the current protests that are happening, but I think they're very much entwined with them. And so I will say, so I think from the, I think this is something that journalism as a whole, as an industry, is wrestling with. And I think it's, if you want to be a part of that contribution to determining what that industry is going to look like in the next 5-10 years, that's a reason to join now, right? Not to say it's a perfect industry, not to say we've reached the goals that we want or even set the right goals, but saying that you can be a vital part of charting the course for this industry, I think is true at the Times, as I hope it is at local papers and papers overseas.
Thanks, Ian. So before I move to my next question, which is going to be, how can a student in this environment best prepare themselves to go to become a journalist? I'm curious, Anne, like as you're listening to all of this, because you're going to be with students all next year, and as you prepare your courses, as you think things through, is there anything that comes out of that conversation that you think, yes, that?
Well, I think if you step back from what everyone's saying, it's that it's journalism is still important. Journalism matters a lot. I think that's been happening since 2016, frankly, when we've been fighting this fake news battle that's been chipping away at journalism and the importance of it. And we have to be reminded of press freedom and the importance of that to our democracy, as Lucia was saying, and Ian, as everyone was saying, really. And we can't lose sight of that. And now more than ever, as we're talking about the goals and the values of Georgetown, that students really should be thinking about more solution-oriented journalism. I love that idea. And as someone who teaches Journalism 100, where we start out talking about fair and balanced stories, it's a very interesting discussion as we're in such a polarized environment, as both with the politically and in every which way. So I think it's super important for students to think about how you know, how can you contribute to this conversation, and what are you contributing, and what are you shining a light on, and who are you holding accountable, and the solution idea, how are you making it better, not how are you just adding to the noise.
Yeah, that's interesting. I know that I said that I was going into the second question, but I changed my mind. So so there's talk from Lucia, and you picked that up with solution-focused journalism. And to be honest, it's not a term that I've necessarily been as familiar with. And I wonder, Lucia, if you want to talk a little bit more about that, or if anyone else would like to discuss like what that means to you, or what does that look like? What does this look to you in journalism in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. Solutions journalism is not that well known, but there are actually quite a few outlets that do it, not systematically, but every so often. The New York Times actually has a column called Fixes that has purely solutions journalism. There are other big media outlets that every so often do it. And there is a really good resource called the Solutions Journalism Network. So if anyone's interested about learning about that, they compile all the solutions journalism stories that they can find in the US and around the world. They also give workshops, etc. But I think the key thing about solutions journalism is that we shouldn't mistake it with feel-good stories or stories about heroes doing something for the community, which have their own value. But solutions journalism, the key of it is that it's evidence-based. So usually it's stories that have evidence and hard data behind them, showing how a particular policy or organization or etc., any kind of change help towards solving a certain problem. So we did a story in Argentina about how the teenage suicide rates were going up all around the country. But we found a specific municipality up in the north of the country where teenage suicide rates were actually going down very quickly. And that was because the government implemented a very holistic policy to support these teenagers through mental health support, through a lot of very different community-based approaches, which led to the suicide rates to go down. So usually it's these kinds of stories where you see a positive change, but in which you can find solutions that have evidence and that you can also apply them to other spaces or places. So I think that's the key about solutions journalism. And there are a lot of really good investigations. I think the Texas Tribune did a really good one about mass incarceration, and all of them you can find on that the Solutions Journalism Network website.
So when we train our reporters, the way we sort of spell it out, and it's well, I should start by saying it's a different. My audience is a little different. So my audience are professionals. These are people either in business or attorneys, lobbyists, so professionals who need us, right? So they come to us not because they want to, but because they have to read the content that we have. But we talk to our reporters and say to them, the best stories contain useful information in a usable format that can then be used by the audience in some way. That it's not enough to just sort of say something happened, but rather go into that and figure out what is it that your audience needs? What is the nut graph of the story? What's the impact of the story? What's the next step in the story? To make sure that it's not, the usability part is, it's not just the technology about it, it's the way it's written. Are you organizing in a way that a busy professional can get through it quickly, but it's also, are you giving them the information they need, or are you forcing them to go elsewhere? And the ultimate part is, can they use it, right? Can they pick up the phone and talk to a member of Congress? Can they call their client? Can they act on it in some way or another? If they can do that, then we're successful. Now, does it have to be directly related to making money? No. Does it have to be that you see an immediate impact? No. But if there is something actionable with it, then the story becomes successful for them.
I was going to pick up a quick point that Lucia was making about the utility of data. I think that how valuable that is, especially in a moment now where I think in two very, very different ways, we're sort of in a moment where American society at the very least, but I think society writ large is confronting two problems, right? Two really hard problems. And one is a viral pandemic, and the other is racism and bigotry and prejudice and how they manifest. And I think actually data is a really useful, I mean, what we've found working on the newsletter the past several weeks, we've really been focusing on, okay, what does the data tell us about either the scale of the problem, so we can actually pinpoint, whether it's where the suicides aren't as high or where gun violence isn't as bad, where incarceration rates are through the roof and where they're not, and how that is disproportionate across different minority groups, but also sort of like just the question of where are interventions in public health working to reduce the number of cases of coronavirus that we're seeing. And so I think to the extent that a lot of journalism has experimented with different forms, but also different types of storytelling, I think data, if you're a student who's interested in sort of finding a way that you can contribute something, I think having like a fluency with data is really valuable, or having a fluency with the ability to present data in a way that's actually, that communicates information, right? That is understandable to a reader is really, really valuable. Both because of the scale, I think the problems that we're writing about, that I find myself writing about every day in the past month, but also in general, like the problems of society, I think are very often ones that can be quantified and then put towards solutions and tested against solutions. And so I think that's really valuable, and it's a skill that I think this industry needs much more.
Thanks for that, Ian. As I realized that I wanted to get to that question, like what can you do, students, to better prepare, right? But everything that you're saying is really leading to that question. I'm thinking about data, and also data journalism. That's I've seen that increasingly. I feel like I could learn a little bit more about it. I wonder if any of you can speak to what is it? So students, if they're interested in data journalism, what does it mean? What does that look like? And are there trends that they need to know about that at the moment, that if they're not aware of this in journalism, they need to be? So I don't know, Anne, I don't want to put you in the spot, but I'm thinking like in the teaching journalism and this classes, is there anything you'd want to say either about trends or data journalism in particular?
Well, Ian's right about the data journalism and understanding that whole concept of getting data sets and breaking them down and somehow writing stories that people can understand off of those numbers. We keep looking for a good professor, so if you know of anyone, let me know, who can teach it. But beyond that, trends, it's always an interesting question. What do students need to know? And we wrestle with this. Do they just need to know critical thinking and how to assess it, how to assess anything that's going on? Or do they actually need to know, how to use video software of a certain kind or podcast editing software of a certain kind? So we try to do both of those things in the undergraduate curriculum. And I think that Paul may be better able to speak to this too, because I think you can get a job and learn pretty much anything. But it's also nice on your resume to say, well, I have created a podcast. I have done some data journalism. I do know how to create an infographic and use certain software or things like that. So I think even more important, though, that we'll probably talk about at some point is things like, are you resourceful? Are you curious? Are you flexible? Are you persistent? Those traits in your personality that really make you a good journalist. You're not giving up. You're fearlessly going after that information, and you're just innately curious. You want to know how people live and why they live that way, and that will serve you well for whatever you're doing and whatever avenue of journalism you go into.
Yeah, to pick up what Anne was saying, a lot of the skills, the kind of highly technical skills that you can learn, those are great, and it's great to have the sort of range of experience. But the other thing about it is every one of those skills comes with an expiration date. You don't necessarily know when it is. It could be 3 months. It could be within a minute. I mean, I joined the workforce, the journalism workforce, and I had incredible technical skills with a pica ruler and spray mount, right? I mean, and these were really useful skills at the time to understand how to deal with point size and how to work with a printer. And within a couple of years, that was all useless because we had moved to word processing. So those skills are interesting, but those skills are interesting not because of the skills in and of themselves, but because the skills point to you as a continuous learner. That is actually, from our perspective, a much more important skill to have than the actual technical skills itself. If you can show that you are trying new things, that you're willing to learn new things, you're able to adapt and then use it, that's more useful than having the depth of experience. Data journalism is absolutely essential at this point. There are two parts to that phrase, though. There's the data part and there's the journalism part. The data part is really important to get, but if you don't have the journalism part down, then you're not going to be able to use that data to tell the kinds of stories that need to be told. And the last point I want to make is building on the point that Anne made. The skills that we really look for, more so than the technical skills, are those more intangible things. Are you a curious person? Are you a persistent person? Are you a continuous learner? And those are not the kinds of things you can say, I am this way, look at this class I took, or look at what this ability that I have, but rather look at the stories that I've told. Look at how I've told them in different formats, and look at how over time I have improved. So it's the story that you're telling about yourself is not a moment in time, but actually an entire sort of school career.
I'm playing with a few questions here. And so I have, and students, I know there's a number of you now on the call, so feel free to type in any questions you have in the chat function. I mean, I have the questions, but I know that you might have ones that are but more specific, and happy to ask for you as well. So use that liberally. So two things, I guess. One, and I don't call it the boring one, but the portfolio piece. So I do get the questions. How do I make a portfolio? What should that look like? What clips do I add? I think that's important. So I want to put that out there. So I'm going to ask, that's going to be there. But the other one, I don't want to lose it. I went to a panel last year, and it was the CNN bureau chief of DC. And he said, journalists are generalists. But if you're coming to me, I'm going to ask you a lot of questions about politics because you're in DC. So I suppose, you know, as you're talking about what makes a good journalist, maybe that's where I'm going to lean to. And we'll get to the portfolio question because I know students are interested. The curiosity, the desire to tell a story, all of these elements that make a good journalist. What do you think of the statement, journalists are generalists, except in certain situations? What are your thoughts on that? I'm just curious. Anyone can answer. If no one will contradict the DC bureau chief of CNN, that is fine, but you can tell me the past.
So again, I'm going to go back to my past. My first beat at my company was, I was 24. I was covering pensions and pension actuaries in particular. I had a great education at Georgetown. Nothing prepared me for that. And there were no questions that they were going to ask me in that interview that was going to get, I'm glad they didn't ask me what an actuary was, because I was thinking it was an kind of accountant, and wasn't until later that I realized, no, these are the people who bet on when you're going to die and when you're going to get sick, right? It's a very different thing. I believe journalists are generalists, especially at the early stage of your career. I think the longer you're in it, the greater the expectation you will have a specialty in a particular area, although that's not necessarily true. I think a good journalist should be able to move from one beat to another. I think a good journalist should be able to do it because the underpinning of journalism is not knowledge of a subject, but an ability to get people who don't want to tell you things to tell you things, an ability to do the kind of research to figure out who has the information to get that information, and then to organize it in a way that actually is inviting and makes people want to read. You should be able to tell a sports story and a legislative story and a regulatory story if you know how to develop sources to get the information you need. Now, does it help to know Congress and DC and politics? Probably, although I think part of the problem is we hire too many people who like politics, which is really more of a horse race, and as a result, we get stories that are not necessarily useful for most people. I think actually a little less politics in Washington might actually be good for all of us. That was an editorial comment, and I apologize for that.
I just want to hear how Ian got his job at the New York Times. What did they want to hear from you?
Oh geez, oh boy. I think by way of answer, I will take on, I think, the prompt that Paul set up, which is I agree, and I want to be really humble about this because I am a really early career journalist, and who knows how long I'll be in this field, and who knows, and I certainly have a lot left to learn. It's so funny because I do think the expertise question or the knowledge question, I think it cuts in a couple different ways, and so I find myself sort of unable to come down on one side. I think on the one hand, there's almost no substitute for knowing your stuff better than anybody else as a journalist. Like I'm speaking of my colleagues when I say this. I'm not speaking of myself. I think being at the Times and being in the role that I'm in, I get to interface with a lot of our journalists who just have attained that level of expertise on whatever it is that they cover in a way that's really, I think, masterful, right, in a lot of ways. And this is not unique to the Times. There are journalists across the field that have that expertise. And whether it's actuaries or politics, there are people that, I think are genuine bona fide experts in what they do. But I also think there's a value to being somebody who is, as curious, open, flexible, able to jump from different subject to subject. I mean, when I first joined the Times, it was in the middle of the healthcare fight over Obamacare repeal. And I was doing research and fact checking for a columnist who knows that stuff cold and has been writing about it for 25 years. And I had to learn how to both what the subject was and also how to sort of translate it back from his easy to understand for a reader way of putting it to the more complicated version of the think tank report that he was getting the information from, and then sort of translate it back into the language that he was going to use to present that to a reader. It was really, it's quite challenging. And I think it does force you to be flexible. And I think being as a journalist, I mean, my posture is always that you are always learning. And that is like a huge, I think of it as a huge privilege of this job, that I can email someone or call them up and they will talk to me, right? And that's kind of a remarkable, it almost is like being in a lecture in college, which I actually enjoyed when I was at Georgetown. The privilege of somebody either wanting to give you information or having information that you need to go dig for is just a really fascinating challenge. And it's a great part of being a journalist. I think the other way that expertise can cut or knowledge can cut is sort of against that, where I think it's sometimes it's people, I think, that go in without a lot of knowledge that actually see the story the clearest, right? They're not sort of wrapped up in conventional wisdoms. They're not blinded by sort of the right way to think about this. I do think that happens in politics coverage, and I think it is worth interrogating when it happens, right? I think people that come with fresh eyes, and that could be either because they never covered a subject before. It can just be because they have different ideas and different perspectives or different background. I think that's why diversity in journalism is valuable, because it's not just about inclusion. It's actually about making our coverage better and more accurate and more useful for more people. So I think that's the other way that knowledge cuts, right? Like it is true that journalism is filled with these mavens of knowledge. It's also true that some of the best stories, I think, come from people that are fresh to a subject, and that's so I think it can be difficult to as a student to be anything but sort of open, curious, and ready to learn, because I think that's the best way to sort of land in the middle of those two things.
Yeah, I have to say, Lucy, I saw your head nodding when which part that Ian said about knowledge being fresh, having fresh set of eyes. I think that was the piece that I'm looking at you nod. I don't know if you wanted to say anything, because we have some questions coming in, so I'm happy to ask those questions that are coming in, but any last words on having that fresh set of eyes? You've done a lot freelancing.
No, absolutely. I think adding to everything that Paul and Ian said, that maybe generalist has maybe a negative connotation, but the ability to look at an issue diagonally, I think, is key. I mean, if you think about the COVID pandemic, yes, it is a public health issue, but it also has to do with economic inequality. When you look at who it affects more, it has to do with race. It has to do with gender inequality. When you think that women are the ones that are being pressured the most in terms of the domestic work they have to do. So being able to look at something with that diagonal, I think is key for any journalist. I mean, I agree that being an expert is very, very valuable, and you need those types of journalists also to do the in-depth stories about these issues. But having a fresh mind, being curious, being open to learn about new things is key. I mean, I majored in international political and economy, but then I am doing stories about mental health. I'm doing stories about indigenous communities in Argentina, and they're all very interesting. It doesn't mean that I have to be an expert to cover those issues, but I do have to have the curiosity and willingness to learn to cover those types of stories.
Great, thank you all. Heading over to the chat. So for recent grads, and this is for the recent grads that are with us not on the panel, but the students that are with us. Just out of curiosity, how did your time at Georgetown affect your career path? So Anne, this does not go to you. So this goes to our other folks here on the panel. Was there a pivotal class you took, person you met, or other activity or experience that helped point you on your way? And anyone is free to answer.
I can start if that's okay. Yeah, so when I started at Georgetown, I had no idea what I wanted to do career-wise. I knew I wanted to do something that would have a positive impact on society. I had no idea what that was going to be. At one point, I thought it might be public policy, and that's why I decided to major in international political economy. But my sophomore year, so I started taking photos for the Georgetown Voice because I love photos. It's one of my hobbies. And my sophomore year, one of my really good friends, Gavin Bade, was the news editor at that time. And he was like, Lucia, why don't you write this story that I need someone to write? It's about workers in Epicurean who are filing a lawsuit against the owner because they're not being paid their overtime wages. And most of these workers were migrant workers from Mexico, and most of them only spoke Spanish or very, very little English. So he needed someone that spoke Spanish to go talk to them and hear their stories. So I went and did it, and I was really scared because, you know, English is not my first language. I had never written a story before, but with his support and encouragement, I ended up writing the story. And a couple of weeks after the story came out, the restaurant settled the lawsuit. So it was very powerful to me to see how, by exposing a story, by hearing the workers and what they had to say, and by just raising awareness about what was happening on campus, somewhere where a lot of us would just hang out every day, something could actually change. So I think that for me was the tipping point, and when I decided, okay, journalism is something that I think is really powerful and that can change, so it can promote a lot of change. So that's when I decided I wanted to be a journalist, and I still majored in IPEC, and I think that gave me a lot of base knowledge and ability to analyze and think about different issues critically. But I think I only took 1 or 2 journalism classes because that was towards the end of my years at Georgetown, so I could only choose 1 or 2 electives. But that to me was the tipping point for when I decided I wanted to become a journalist.
Lovely.
Yeah, I'll echo some of that. Sorry to anybody who worked for the Hoya or reads the Hoya, but yeah, I'm also going to credit the Voice with yes, absolutely, with me getting to be a journalist, right? I think that I came into college not really knowing what journalism was, to be honest. Like I really think that it was not something that my parents are not information hounds like that. They're not, journalism was never like a thing in my household really that we talked about, or it was sometimes on in the background, but no journalists in my family. I just knew that I really loved writing. I thought I would be like a fiction writer or a poet or something. And which is funny now that I think back on it, because it was just so terrible. But I also knew that I really loved politics. I loved history, and it wasn't until I got to Georgetown that actually somebody sort of thrust in my face the vehicle that could be a combination of those two things, right? Using the medium of writing, and not that that's the only way to do journalism by any means, but using that medium to tell stories about those subjects. And so I don't know. I think I knew I sort of had the things that I knew I loved, and then I had to find the thing that would weave them together in a sort of different way. And I think by the time I was midway through college, I sort of decided I was going to try to give this a shot. And I think being in DC, being at Georgetown, I think for the kind of journalism I wanted to do, which is admittedly often really focused on national politics, there was no better place to be. And so I think to the extent that I was able to take advantage of that situation, do a lot of internships during the school year, I think was really valuable for sounding out the industry, right? Just feeling like, okay, what part of this actually appeals? What part of this job and this landscape of an industry actually looks promising or looks of interest? And I don't know. I really think that was a really valuable place to be, and I'm lucky for it. That's all I can say.
Paul?
So I'm not a recent grad, but I will defend the Hoya as well as the Voice. I have a more than 3-decade career in journalism that is rooted in my time working first at the Voice and then at the Hoya. When I was at Georgetown, there wasn't not only wasn't there a minor, there wasn't even a class offered in journalism. It wasn't something that was even available. So academically, that was not a path. It was just actually doing it. And I mean, ultimately, and don't fire me as an adjunct when you hear what I'm about to say, it's not really about the classes, and the most successful journalists that I have working for me are not people who have degrees in journalism or come out from the top schools of journalism. They are oftentimes, if you talk to them, you find out they were an editor on their school paper. They were a reporter on their school paper, and it is that experience that is formative. And in some ways more valuable than experience on a lot of internships that you may have, because internships are limited both in time and also in the type of work you get. Very few internships are going to let you really work. You're usually there with a big safety net all around you, whereas you have no safety net when you're on a school paper. If you don't do that story doesn't get done. If you don't assign it, it doesn't. No one's going to do it for you. So go.
Can I add really?
Voice.
Oh, I was just going to add very, very quickly. I agree with all that, and I'll also say one of the advantages to working on The Voice, I think, or getting involved in journalism on campus, is the freedom to make mistakes. Not that there are no consequences for it. There sometimes are, and certainly I and we made mistakes as student journalists. But I think the value of making those mistakes in that setting versus in an internship or in your later career, I think is really valuable. So there's that too. There's to the extent there's a safety net in internships, that's true. There also can be one that's valuable and worth testing when you are a student journalist.
And the only thing I'll say is that for all of these reasons, journalism is not a major at Georgetown, which is something we talk a lot about. Do you need to major in it? It's a minor, and that sets you up to be, like Lucia so perfectly, you're an expert in the economy or in whatever, and then you go and you learn some of these other journalism things to think about in courses, perhaps, or you get to hear good speakers at least. So that's all I want to add.
All right, thanks all. Moving on to the next question. So this is from a recent grad. Positions are quite competitive, especially considering the number of seasoned reporters who've been laid off and are also applying for jobs. What do the panelists recommend in regards to how recent grads can best market themselves in this kind of environment? Should they emphasize previous internships? again, we talked a little bit about portfolios, how important, how relevant, anything that you can, any tips that you can give to, recent grads who are very interested in getting out there in the world.
So a couple tips in that regard. For the most part, you're not really going to be competing with some of those seasoned journalists who are out of work. There are positions that really are sort of aimed, and you can look at, when you look at a job description, they're clearly aimed at people who are early in their careers there. There are natural things that someone just coming out of school has, so the skills and experiences that actually differentiate themselves from somebody who is who's been out of school for a while and in the workplace for a while. But I think the most important, the couple points that I would make: one, when you're thinking about your story, when you're thinking about your own story and how you're going to position yourself, look at your work and try to come up with those stories that would not have been told had you not told them. Spend time really, really curating the work that you have, because what's going to get you a job is your work. And you want to put your best work forward. And the best work for most news outlets isn't necessarily the kinds of stories that are actually directly on point for that. So let's say you are, I know Industry Dive right now is looking for someone to cover education. You don't necessarily have to go through your portfolio and look for a clip that shows that you covered education, because that might not be your best story, right? What you want is, if you worked on a data story, if you got a scoop, if you had an exclusive, if you had a feature that was really source rich, if you actually took a fresh angle to a story that everybody else was covering in a different way, that's your best story. Because you have to be able to not just have that story speak for itself, but you need to be able to speak about what you put into it. And this is where we gauge your curiosity. This is where we gauge your tenacity. This is where we gauge your skepticism, those sort of harder characteristics to sort of nail down. And so you want to make sure that you're putting forward the stories that show you at your best. The only other thing I would say about portfolios is I get a lot of really, really, really beautifully crafted portfolios that I can't figure for the life of me how to navigate. They are so fabulous that they actually get in the way of the work itself. And I even get resumes that are so beautifully laid out, and then they don't render well in our system. So don't go overboard on some of these, because it's not really important, unless you're a graphic artist or a web designer, right? And then have at it. But if you're going into journalism, let your words, let your sounds, let your images, let your recordings actually speak for themselves, and make it as easy and as accessible as you can.
I'd like to add two things to what Paul was saying. So in terms of portfolio, I understand that many of you might not have one unless you actually are writing for one of the school papers. And when that happens, my recommendation would be to build it. So when after my year at Al Jazeera, I had to move back to Argentina because of visa issues. I'm not a US citizen, so I wasn't allowed to stay. And that's when I decided I wanted to be a freelancer. And that's also when I decided I wanted to go into video journalism. But I had no idea how to do it. So I bought myself a camera, a microphone set with my savings, and I learned by myself. But a lot of the employers or people that were looking for freelancers wanted for me to show them work samples. And of course, I didn't have any videos that I had filmed. So I just went out and went to a protest in Buenos Aires and filmed the story, interviewed people as if I was doing it for an outlet, but I wasn't. I was doing it for myself, edited the video and did that a couple of times and put that up on my website. Of course, if you have something like that, but that's actually being published, it's more valuable. But if you don't, and you're able to do that, I think that shows also your initiative, your willingness to go out to the ground and learn. So I would definitely recommend that. I mean, I wouldn't find myself desperate in case you don't have like an amazing portfolio from which to choose from. And the second advice I would give is reach out to as many people as you can, and don't be ashamed, and don't think, oh, you know, you're overstepping. When I came to Argentina after my year in New York, I didn't know anyone working as a journalist here, and I basically Googled, you know, foreign correspondents in Argentina. There was an association. I emailed 30 of the journalists that were on that list. I went onto Twitter and I also did the same, like journalists Buenos Aires, and I found 10 with interesting profiles and I direct messaged them. So I think I contacted, I don't know, 50 people, maybe 10 got back to me, but out of those 10, 2 ended up in actual job opportunities, and the other 8 were just nice conversations, and I got to meet people and learn from them. So in that sense, I would just not be afraid of reaching out. Even when you say there's no way this guy is going to respond to me. I remember at that time there was one of the editors at 538 had tweeted something like, oh, we're looking for stories, if you're a freelancer, email me. And I was like, there's no way they're going to be interested about stories from Argentina, blah, blah, blah. But I just emailed him. And like the same day he responded, and he was like, yeah, we would love to do more stuff from Latin America. Why don't you send me some pitches? And I ended up writing 3 or 4 stories for them. So yeah, all that to say, just contact people, and yeah, just do it. And if they don't respond, it doesn't matter, but the few people that respond will be valuable people to have.
That's excellent, Lucia. Thank you. Ian, I'm curious how that tracks with your journey as well.
Sure. I think Lucia is far more enterprising than I am. I'll say that. I think, but in seriousness, I will echo a lot of what she said. I think it's so funny. Journalism is I think it is for the social good in so many ways. It is a field that exists as a kind of service in a way to the public. It's also filled with a lot of people that are have large egos and will respond positively if you say, I liked your story, can we get coffee? Or maybe can we do a Zoom call over coffee during the pandemic? I do think it's, yeah, and you know, one of the things that's really struck me is working at the Times. I mean, it's a totally intimidating place to be. I think maybe any workplace is this way when you're right out of college and you're a kid and you don't know what you're doing. But one thing that has struck me is how really, really generous with their time almost every one of my colleagues has been. And you know, it's one thing I think when you're coming from within the walls of the building to talk to people, but I mean, but they really don't have to spend their time talking to me, and they don't have to spend their time answering my questions or pointing me towards better sources on a story or giving me feedback. But a lot of them will. And I mean, that was my experience too before I got there, and it's been my experience in lots of other workplaces. And so I will say that I mean, I really think, yeah, sometimes the advantage goes to the people that are just willing to send that email and reach out and ask for help or just send a compliment. Journalists are always tweeting emails they get that are abusive and horrible. So if you can be a counterweight to that in their inbox, I think that's valuable. And then the one last thing I'll say about sort of applying, I mean, I would say it's, again, there's a middle ground, I think, between sort of casting a pretty wide net and finding opportunities that are actually going to be a good fit, where you're not just sort of wish casting, or you're not putting a lot of effort into applying for something that's probably not going to result. And I say that from experience, because I think I did a lot of that, and I ended up with a lot of no responses or rejections in part because of that. But I also think, I mean, to some extent, like, especially when the opportunities are limited, this becomes a numbers game. And to the extent that you can find, as Paul was saying, opportunities that are sort of targeted for early career journalists, of which there are many, and they're often very clearly labeled. You know, my effort was to try to target that, and it was by no means always successful. But I think it's the right way to try to maximize the chances that you're going to find some sort of fit. And even if it's something like Lucia said, even if it's not leading directly to a job opportunity or an offer, I think those outreaches are still really valuable in just familiarizing yourself with the industry. And I'll always say that you never sort of know how somebody can be helpful to you later if you're helpful to them today. So I sort of feel like that's something to bear in mind as well as you're in this sort of weird space where applications are happening, but it's a tricky.
To build on that, one of the things that you will have to do as a journalist is you're going to have to cold call people and ask them questions. And oftentimes you have to cold call people, ask them questions that they don't want to answer, right? So what better way to show that you're willing to do that than to cold call people in the profession and say, can we talk about how you got your job? Can we talk about what you look for in someone hiring? Not because there's a job in front of you, but because you are interested in learning how to get that job. It is a way to show you have a skill, an ability to do something, and a willingness to do something without actually being on assignment to do it, right? It is something that we're always going to look for. It is hard making those calls, right? Nobody likes to face that rejection. Nobody wants to call it, well, I shouldn't say nobody, but most of us don't like calling total strangers and asking personal questions about their careers. It's not something we're all trained to do. But by doing it, you are actually showing that you are a journalist. It is part of journalism. I will add one other thing. Connect with people like me on LinkedIn. Not that I'm going to do anything for you in particular. I mean, I will try my best, but it's not about that. It is about my network, right? Because LinkedIn is really important. And once you're connected with me, you're connected with my network. You're connected to Lucia's network, Ian's network, Anne's network, right? You want to have our networks as part of yours.
Yeah, something you said, Paul, it was a number of years ago that I was working with an alum, fairly senior at CBS, and she said, you know, I'm hard to reach. And if you manage to get me on the phone, I'm already impressed by you because it's just hard to reach me, you know, so that. Okay, moving on. Just out of curiosity, like when you started in the field, was there anything that surprised you? This is open to anyone. Anything that you said to yourself, would have been helpful if I had known that one before?
I'm sorry, I was just looking, my watch was telling me that several of you reached out to connect with me on LinkedIn. So that's really good on that. So I will say, I really wish that I had taken an accounting class. I cannot tell you how beneficial it would have been to know how to read a spreadsheet, from looking at, from having to cover budgets, from having to work with employers, and then as a manager myself, having to work with it. And it's the one, I got a great education at Georgetown. Accounting was not part of it, and it's the only thing that I wish I had taken. I will say I purposely avoided it, and I was wrong. So.
Anyone else? I'm curious, Anne, when you started USA Today, was there anything, did you have a background in entertainment, just a fondness for it? But
journalism's funny that way. You can sort of fall into things and get lucky, and that goes for whether you're reporting or you're just doing your career. When I started, I was at the Washington Post, like I said, answering phones, and one night they needed someone. I worked the 2 to 8 shift in the style section. They needed someone to go cover a party because Sandra Day O'Connor had just been sworn in as the first Supreme Court female justice. And I had on jeans and I had to change clothes with a copy editor and run down the street and get good quotes and come back and write it. And that's what I liked. I liked the speed of journalism. I like the fast pace of it. That's not really answering your question. At USA Today, that sort of led me into entertainment or parties, things like that feature side of things. And several times after growing really weary of writing about the Kardashians and Lindsay Lohan, I asked to write about health. I remember when the New York Times started its wellness column, and I thought that was great. And they just kept saying, no, you've built up all these sources in the entertainment industries. Keep doing that. And it wasn't until, actually, I say I'm not a journalism grad, but I did just get a master's in aging and health. So finally, after all this time, I can write about health. But I think you have to go, you sort of go where it leads you, and you never quite know where that may be, but it's always fun, I will say that. And just to some of these other points, networking, of course, you might be asked, how have you used this pandemic time for something? You should be doing whatever you can, however you can get clips or tell stories or blog or post photographs, anything like that that you might have to show for your time. And just do journalism. Like we're saying, you don't have to wait for that degree in it. You don't have to wait to be told, here's your assignment. You can be the proactive one. You can be the one pitching and seeking out and seeing. And don't forget local news. Look around you, what's happening in your neighborhood, because you'll know it. And the New York Times would probably love to know if you have a great story happening right in your neighborhood that you're the expert on, because you're there seeing it.
Actually, that's a great point. There was another question that came in, but I want to stick with local news for a second, because that's something that came up in our pre-panel discussion, the importance of local news. I know for a lot of our students, there's, how do I get to, say, Al Jazeera? How do I get to BBC News? How do I get to the Times? How does that happen? But would anyone like to speak to local news?
I think, even though I have worked for Al Jazeera and I'm currently working for the BBC, the time when I learned the most was as a freelancer, and also at Redacción right now where I'm at, because even though it's not a well-known name in Argentina, increasingly so, but outside of Argentina, no one knows about it. It is those places that will most times empower you the most. So I am, when I have an idea about a new format or about a new story we should do, or we should start engaging with our audiences more on Instagram, those types of ideas in a small newsroom, most of times local newsrooms, you're allowed to do that. You're allowed to experiment. You're allowed to do new things. And I think that is key. I mean, I understand a lot of people want to start off at the New York Times or the New Yorker or whatever, but there's a difference between starting there and, just transcribing interviews versus being at a local newspaper and actually be able to do your own reporting, go out to the ground and do your own investigations. So I think that's key. I know a lot of us are, you want to aim for the top and are anxious about it, but it's many times in the smaller places where you'll learn the most.
Yeah, I'll agree with all of that. And I'll share two things. I think one is that it's so interesting because I think it used to be the case that if you wanted to end up at a big national outlet, one of the ways to do that was to start at a smaller, more local paper, work your way up to a regional paper, and end up at a national paper. And I do think that that model of journalism has a little bit changed, but I don't think it's changed quite as much as a lot of people think. I mean, I think it really is supremely valuable to do local coverage, and I'll on that point I'll say two things. One is there was a point that I sort of at one point sort of had the choice of, do I go to this national outlet or do I take an internship at my local paper in Maine, where I'm from? And I don't think there's any, I loved my internship at the national magazine that I ended up going to, but I don't think there's any choice that I've made in my career, as short as it has been, that I've regretted more, right? Like I think actually going to a local outlet is skill building in a different kind of way. It is finding the sort of stories that are right in your backyard. It's being in a place, yeah, as Anne was saying, that you know well, it's your backyard, and you know this space, and so you know a little bit what's a story and what's not. And so I share that only because I think in some ways I made the wrong choice there. In a strange way, I sometimes think that, only because I think it's so valuable, and because I think, especially as the pandemic has sort of put a spotlight on, these are the kind of outlets that need a lot of help sometimes, and need the kind of fresh blood to reinvigorate them, because they are essential for the community, and yet the business model has sort of passed them by. And so I think to the extent that you can look at programs like Report for America that try to put young people in local newsrooms, consider that, right? I think that's a really valuable sort of way to counteract the business current that's currently making things challenging for these outlets. And then the last thing I'll say is, even on a national outlet, I think there are ways to try to think locally. And I mean, the one story I'll say is when last year, it was last summer during the middle of the presidential primary debates. And so I was sort of hunting around for some story that I could do on my own in the time I had to, that would sort of weave in a national context, but in a more local setting. And so I started calling around to debate leagues in the Washington area that were having summer camps, because I figured that some of them might be sort of looking at those national debates and using them as models, or as more likely as exemplars of what not to do when you're debating and trying to debate effectively. And so I found one. There's a Washington Urban Debate League in DC that was running this week-long camp during one of the debates, and they were sort of having the younger kids like pretend they were one of the candidates and sort of mock their point of view, try to portray that point of view that they would have said on the debate stage. And then the older kids were actually sort of looking at the videos of the debate from the night before and sort of looking at them with a really critical eye. And I do think that one of the great joys of doing that story was being at a national outlet, but actually finding a way to make national politics and stuff that feels so momentous and important, quote unquote important, feel local and actually matter. Find a way that it actually mattered to people in their real lives, not just as spectacles and not just as sort of highfalutin who's going to be the next president talk. Like it was really interesting to try to think in that way. And I guess it's my penance for not working at a local outlet that I was sort of I felt like that was a valuable story for the Times to do, right? As a place that doesn't, I think, that sometimes does forget about the local impact, especially of Washington stories. To find a way to do that, I think was felt like it was a story worth pursuing. So even if you're at a national outlet, the lesson being there are ways to try to make things, make your thinking and make your coverage local also.
Wonderful. Okay, guys, it looks like, if I'm looking at time, and I can't believe we talked this long, but we have one last question I think we can get to, and then I'm going to throw it back to Beth, who has a kind of a nice wrap-up reflection question for the panelists and for the students. So the question that came in, and Lucia, it reminds me of basically what you recommended earlier, that if you don't have a portfolio, if you don't have experience, how do you go out and get experience, right? You didn't have that, so you went out and you got it. So the question is, what advice do you have for students this summer to gain valuable experience if we were unable to get an internship with the publication? So yes, it's true. A lot of internships did not necessarily go remote. There were micro internship opportunities. Not all publications took them. There was just a lot of, I think, chaos within HR what to do. So I think that weighs heavily on students. And even I think all of you wonderfully addressed that having that experience with the Hoya, the Voice, anything that you have in that piece, but also maybe speaking to like, what can they do? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, I would definitely take advantage of this time to keep on learning. So if you want to go into video journalism and you haven't necessarily taken a class about it, then go online. There's so many resources that teach you how to film, how to edit, how to sound edit, etc. And go out on your neighborhood and just film a story. It can be anything, like a story about your family's day or how a local business is pushing through the pandemic. Really anything that will give you the practice and skills that you'll be able to show eventually in an application. And I think that is key, to show that you are curious, that you are pushing and want to learn in spite of the whole context, of course, that's extremely adverse. I think that is key. Just innovate and think out of the box. Do your own written reports and actually call people and do your local reporting, even though it's not going to be published anywhere besides your website, but that shows initiative, and I think a lot of employers like that.
Wonderful, thank you. Anyone else?
I'll make a really small suggestion. Oh, Paul, why don't you go ahead? I've talked a lot.
It's okay. I agree, though. You have to do something, right? I mean, we're at a point where everybody will have everyone will have a big asterisk on their resume for this summer, and I think I can imagine at some point one of the questions that will be asked in job interviews will be, "What did you do the summer of COVID? What did you do then?" And again, do something, right? Whether it's take a class, whether it's try to learn a skill, work, interact with folks. It doesn't have to be in journalism. It could just be in the world and just be part of the world. In journalism, there's a lot of opportunities to have some stories published that don't necessarily have to be affiliated, attached to an internship or a big company. Pick a hyperlocal blog or news outlet. So, here in DC, there's DCist, there's The Hill is Home, and the Georgetown Current, and all those sorts of papers. And every community has a hyperlocal paper. If you can swing it, you could probably get to do a story if you're willing to not be paid for it, right? If you have a little bit of leeway in that way, do the story. The story is currency in and of itself, and figure out how you get paid doing some other kind of work. Local, getting back to the previous questions, local journalism is really essential, and it is a building block for any kind of job that you're going for in the future. And as long as you're showing that you're trying to work, that would be fine. Even if you're submitting content for summer editions of the Voice and the Hoya, that's not a bad thing. That's actually a good thing as well.
I'll just say really quickly, I don't want to admire sort of the problem that a lot of students are in, but I do want to sort of express some sympathy, some empathy for it. Like it's really challenging, and I can only imagine the frustration, right, of having this be sort of the circumstance that you're graduating into, or you had something lined up and it's not going to work out. So I do want to say that, and I also, I think is absolutely the right answer to the question. I think it's worth acknowledging that it's really, it's harder for some than others. And, I'm here in Maine with my girlfriend, and her mom is very sick. And so that's been sort of a drain on time for all of us. And because we want to be helpful. And so I want to also acknowledge that, it's an uneven playing field, right? And this sort of just magnifies that. And that's really hard. So I just think it bears saying, even though I don't have a solution, and I wish I did. But the one thing I will also say in terms of advice is, one thing that I always found really valuable was making sure, as much as I wanted to be writing journalism, was also that I was reading it. I think it's really easy to sort of lose, to squeeze. It's been very easy for me to squeeze that sort of activity out of my day, the actual consuming of journalism, or I would encourage you to, if you do have more time on your hands than you expected this summer, if there's a journalist whose byline you sort of just thrill to, read everything that they produce, right? Or I think it's a good way to learn how to get better at writing, if that's the craft you want to do, or video production, if there's an anchor that you really admire. I would encourage you to do that. And I also think, to the extent that it is a way for you to see places where stories aren't being told, where there might be sort of an opening for you, because of the perspective you bring, or an experience you've had that sort of, or just an idea you have that isn't being reported on. I think reading what's out there and being really attentive to the way it's being crafted is a way to see those openings. It's a way to learn, which I think is the best use of time when you have it, but it's also a way to sort of take advantage of places where this industry has left gaps, maybe for somebody like you. So it's a hopeful sentiment, I hope, even though it's a difficult time.
I meant to make one more point, and I'm sorry for doing this. Going back to the conversation we had about doing a little bit of networking, this could be your summer of networking. This could be the summer where you are reaching out and maybe doing an informational interview every other day, tapping into the Georgetown network and talking to alumni there, building up LinkedIn, whatever it happens to be. But that's an option that you could spend as well. You're kind of planting seeds that might not bear fruit for a while, but it's certainly worth your time doing that.
Thank you. Okay. Wow. We did a good job. That was close to an hour and a half. But before we're over, I want to throw it back to Beth for maybe a final question reflection. And yeah, Beth.
Yeah, so I think a couple of you, Ian, you kind of touched on this, but for the panelists, I'd like you to think about what is an activity or a reflection. We've talked a lot about how students can do journalism or how they can use their time over the summer. So my challenge is, what is one thing a student could either do, reflect on, or plan to do that could set them up for success with the next step, whether that's an internship or a job after graduation? That's something they can do over the summer.
I don't know if you have it. I think all of you have touched on it.
Yeah, you guys have all touched on it, but.
Actually, Lucy, I'm going to pick on you because I think yours is like, be innovative, do it yourself.
That's right. But I was trying to find something more specific. And I think one good thing you could do is build your own website. It's actually something I did very early on. I think right after my senior year at Georgetown. I mean, I didn't have much to put on there, but at least, you know, it had my bio, my resume, my few clips from the Georgetown Boys. And whenever I emailed someone, you know, I send that link with that. And I started building on top of that when I started publishing videos when I was a freelancer, my work as a producer, et cetera, et cetera. And now I still have it and I still update it every so often because I think it's a really good way to put everything you have done in one place. And it's a really fun project. I use Wix, which is a very easy to use platform, very user friendly. You just drag and drop, and it's fun. I actually really enjoy, and I'm quite obsessive with it. So I think that could be a nice, useful project to have.
Thanks, Lucia. Anyone else?
I guess I'll say, I think in addition to reading and sort of making a study, I think of a journalist you admire, I think that'd be a really useful, it was useful for me as I was trying to learn how to do this and still am learning how to do it. I also think, I'm gonna suggest, if you don't have a Twitter account, make one and use it specifically more for taking in than putting out. Because my own experience is, I think, I think people overrate the value of like constant production on Twitter. My own view is, I think, similar to hopefully some others on the panel, that, you know, it's your work, it's ultimately your work that is going to speak for you. And there are journalists whose majority of their work is on Twitter. I don't encourage you to be one of those. And I think, but Twitter is supremely useful for sort of seeing what is out there, what people are talking about, what is the narrative around a story, what are sort of dissenting views from that predominating narrative, whatever it be. It's, again, I think it's, to the extent that my posture in journalism is always to be learning, I think it's a really useful way to carry that through, and it can be overwhelming, so take breaks from it if you need. Don't feel like you need to be glued to it every day. But I think it's a useful way to see what people who write the coverage, make choices about the coverage, decide sort of what is news, what they think. It's useful to know, even if you don't share their view. Maybe especially if you don't share their view.
Yep. I will say that sometimes we do also see job advertisements on Twitter by lots of different organizations. So it doesn't hurt
Also
in that
true.
respect either.
Also true. Good.
As someone who spends a good deal of his time actually watching Twitter and having to tell people to take that down and don't do that, you might, I can build on, this is Ian's, part of Ian's suggestion, not mine, but go through your Twitter feed and pull down things that really shouldn't be there. This might be a good time to sort of clean up your Twitter. I would say this would be a good time for you to do a skills inventory, a kind of, in a sense, sort of look through, maybe sort of think about how you are going to phrase that kind of intro on LinkedIn, who you are, what you're looking for, what your kind of elevator pitch is. Go through, do what I was saying earlier today. Curate your stories. Make sure that your portfolio you're telling the story about yourself as a journalist that you want, sort of putting forward your best work, the stories that wouldn't have been told without you. Think about the skills that you have and think maybe about some of the gaps in those and figure out a plan for how you might plug those in, and spend your time sort of networking as well. But this is regardless of whether you've graduated or you're getting ready to graduate, sort of being prepared, sort of mapping out what you have and what you don't have is always a good use of your time.
And anything that you'd like to?
Gosh, I know. As everyone was talking, I was thinking, okay, I can't say that, it's been covered. I loved what Ian said about reading and really looking at what's out there and finding somebody you like or somebody whose work you admire and following that. I loved what Lucia said about teaching and teaching yourself new skills or learning something new. We do have one course we're offering called Covering a Pandemic that starts in a week or two. So if you really have nothing else to do, you could at least get one of your electives done for journalism, or just take it because it's a good course. But I guess think about what's important to you. What do you want to do? How are you going to get there? It's all of what Paul just said too, of shaping yourself up so that you're presenting your best self to the world, and that but you're really thinking about what you like to do, because it's important. Like Ian said, he was thinking about politics, or what is, a lot of students say to me, I don't really want to do politics. And here we are at Georgetown where it's just so everything. So what really is important to you, and how will you kind of figure out your path to that? And don't let anything stop you, because like Lucia, it's hard to get that hustle going as a freelancer. It's hard to pull yourself out of the pandemic distractions and truly maybe very real circumstances that you're facing on a daily basis that make it difficult. But there will be a time when you will come out of it. We will come out of it, and you'll want to be thinking about where you're headed and how you can best get there.
Sorry, I was just taking down some notes. So that's all. I think that's all in your chat function. Everything, all the suggestions people had. I think we're good time. So I want to thank everyone for being here. Really appreciate the conversation. I learned so much. The students probably did as well. Beth, any last minute administrative tasking, logistics, anything for panelists or students?
No, students, I'll be sending out a follow-up email that will include some of these thoughts for suggestions, as well as a survey you can take. So keep a lookout for that in the next day or two. But thank you again to our panelists. This is really a wonderful discussion. So we thank you for your time.
Yes.
Yep.
All right. All have a wonderful evening.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Take care, everyone.
Okay. Good night. Bye.
Be safe. Bye.